talk about Bapu a little bit.
My
How
father.
was what was he like?
Well, he was a fun guy. That was the thing. Anything for a laugh. Uh, he liked to entertain people that he was visiting. Uh, he was a joke cracker. Uh, I think he loved my mother, and even though my mother at times was very difficult to deal with, uh, I think he coped by being away from the house, work for, long hours, and then when there was the opportunity to go and socialize in a cafe or something or a tavern, he was prone to do that. Now, he had his close friend, and they were drinking buddies. And it didn't matter who he met, they became drinking buddies. And quite often he would come home pretty drunk. And when he didn't show up, my mother was in anguish and anger, and especially it was payday, and I saw him at least half a dozen times, if not a dozen or more times, on his return, being pretty inebriated. Most of the time, if he hadn't shown up, we were asleep when he finally did show up, and maybe there was a raucous and argument about that. But this friend that we talked about uh, was actually my brother's godfather too. So there's a Greek song about the Kubaro and and being the lover at the same time, or the woman having the husband by day and the lover by night, or the Kubaro by night. But I just happened to think about that later, just coincidental. But I say my father struggled to bring home the money at the end of the week. In fact, quite often I know that by Wednesday he had to borrow money for the rest of the week. I mean, there were no funds till payday, if you will. So I don't think he ever got out from under that. In other words, by the time he could pay back that loan, he was already short the following Wednesday, and so on. And he was always looking to save money and to scrounge. And I remember one time, to increase the income, he would carry home, I'd have to guess, over 50-pound boxes of nuts and bolts and washers. And at night, he would dump them on the floor, and he and my mother and I would just begin assembling them, because I don't know, maybe he made 50 cents a thousand or something on return, making the manual assemblies, and which meant he had to cart them back the next day, that kind of thing. I remember that on a couple of occasions. I know. I don't think we had butter and very little oil in the house. The cooking was done by buying fat, suet essentially, and rendering it. It would be done maybe once every couple of months, and it would be a big, large kettle that night, maybe Friday night on payday, go out and buy all this fat scraps and then render it, which was meant heating up to very high temperatures to dissolve, and then it was filtered, and that became our cooking oil, our cooking grease. So, and to this day, the smell of kerosene brings back those unpleasant poverty days to me, because we lived on the fourth floor of a tenement, cold water flat, where it was heated only by the fuel oil, which in those days is not like the current kerosene heaters that the Japanese have invented, which are tip-proof. That those heaters were fed by gravity from a horizontal tank that was filled, a cylindrical tank with a plunge valve. So you fill that tank and inverted it quickly into an open tub, and it was just a gravity feed that fed the wick, and sometimes it overflowed. And I remember the unpleasant task I had of taking a 5-gallon square can those tin cans, and going down and walking several blocks to the fuel oil dealer who would fill it. And then I'd have to haul that 40-pound tin back and up the stairs and then have to fill with a funnel that cylindrical feed tank, which you could never fill perfectly. There was a spill, and you'd smell that kerosene. It was not deodorized or this clean K1 that they talk
Smells
about.
like jet fuel, right?
Well, it's number 2 oil. It's kerosene. It's fuel oil number 2. It's all the same cut. And so when people tell me, "Oh, this heater today is odorless," forget it. You can smell it when the flame goes out, and you can smell it before it starts. Maybe it's odorless as it burns, but so that was an image I had. I remember at times where we had didn't even have an oil burner for heat. It was a wood-burning cold and cooking stove, iron stove, and there was never, and it was usually coal-fed when you got fire going, so that meant hauling the coal occasionally. But we would burn wood, and there were times when I went around the neighborhood scrounging for firewood. I didn't have a wagon, so I don't remember what I carried it back in. But I remember one time when it was quite cold, and my mother started breaking up chairs and furniture on top of the bed so the neighbors could not hear the cracking of wood, you know, that kind of thing. And I remember one apartment where you actually fed the gas meter with quarters out in the hall. And usually those apartments had giant black iron cook stoves, so you could heat, and we lived in essentially the old railroad style apartments at times, and that meant in the winter you never occupied the front room. The 2 bedrooms were joined to the living room, if you will, which had an offset kitchen. And but I remember we had a radio by that time, and I lived by the radio. I mean, I couldn't get enough information, and back then, and after school, were the serials, the Jack Armstrong and Captain Midnight and things of that sort. And with the radio, of course, the imagination was fantastic. And Little Orphan Annie and Mandrake the Magician, and there were dozens and dozens of 15-minute programs, children on the radio. So I grew up with the radio. In fact, I don't think we had a telephone till I got a full-time job after college. I brought a telephone in the house. I brought all the appliances. I was the breadwinner then. I was making so much more money than my father. I estimated that until World War II came along, where he got a decent position as a laborer in the shipyards, I don't think he made more than $25 a week, $20 a week during his whole life. And I made that much in high school during the summer. There was one occasion I recall he tried to make a little bit of extra income during the summer. Someone suggested to him, "Hey, Bill, why don't you sell sodas?" You know, during lunch hour. It was a loft building with different manufacturing operations, and people would go out for lunch, or someone. That was before the lunch wagons that would come by. And so we found a distributor of soda, and during the summer he had purchased a giant galvanized wash tub and got a little cart, and we would buy the ice locally, and I would haul I'd borrow a little industrial cart out of one of the places up there, and we would invest in maybe half a dozen assorted different kind of drinks. Didn't matter what the variety was. Well, someone was always looking for another flavor, you know. So next time you bought that flavor, and he never would buy it again, you know. So you'd have all these tubs, you know, and then I would go up to the different floors. And some places they didn't want me to go into the floors. So, but it was in that foyer in front of the freight elevator, or the elevator leading up to where the people would come out for lunch and possibly buy a soda and so on. And
So
that
this
that
was,
lasted one summer. It didn't amount to anything. I doubt if we made any money by the time we were all through. But it kept me busy at about the age of 12 or 11, I think.
so so
So
you were talking about this loft
my father.
building, or this is one on Astor Place. This is a manufacturing building,
This
or
could have been one on Chamber Street. He worked in various buildings around there. Yeah, in that kind of. I know there was one operation that made. I think the company was called Microlight. They made dry cell batteries for little keychains and the one cell, what would be equivalent to an AA battery today. They actually made those batteries as trays and trays of extruded zinc shells, and the workers would mix the manganese dioxide, zinc chloride, put them in and pot them, insert the carbon and crimp them, and then another operation would insert them in little flashlights and assemblies. That was one operation. Don't remember the different manufacturing operations, different floors, but I remember that one where I was allowed to go in and deliver the sodas to the employees.
so
To, to,
your mother was she? She didn't hide anything from you guys, huh? I mean, she
well,
basically whatever was on her mind, she would just say
well,
it,
she
or
would say it. I think, as I said before, she was socially terrified, I would say, at times. And so I think she put up a good front by making stories up. If we would visit someone, she'd just create something right away why we hadn't been seen or we were away, or, which I knew were, just stories. And I just accepted you never told the truth when you met people. I got that image. And, until I got into high school and started, I really never really matured till I went into the service. That was, of course, I came later, and you're asking me about this, but I was fortunate enough to go to Brooklyn Technical High School, where we had all the technical courses. So by the first year, I could run a lathe, I could do sheet metal work, I could do carpentry, forge. They had a forge. We actually made wrought iron chain links, and these were all skills that came in handy in the future. So I was exposed to that. And of course, I had entered the chemistry course, and I was just fascinated by chemistry. I couldn't read enough. So by the time I took a course, I knew almost as much as the professor. I mean, there wasn't enough. Yeah, I would read about the history of. I'd go to the library. We have, living where we were in Brooklyn, for maybe 4 to 6 block walk, I could go to the public library in Grand Army Plaza, which was fantastic. It was comparable to, on a smaller scale, to the New York Public Library. I spent so much time in the library. And besides, I do the reading I'm particularly interested in at the time. But I read virtually every chemistry book on that shelf. And then in high school, I joined what was called the Laboratory Preparation Squad. So that was setting up the chemicals and the equipment for different chemistry lab courses. Well, I had access to all the chemicals, and so I liberated just about an ounce or so, a few grams of virtually every chemical that I could bring. And so I was able to, in the basement of some of the places we lived, to carry on chemistry experiments that I read about. I had to prove it to myself. Made some nitroglycerin at one point. Fortunately, it never exploded. But I would make, I'd be an expert on pyrotechnics, because that's always a fascinating thing. I found out how to make an electric furnace so that at high temperatures I could fuse and do many things. I guess I read the experiment sections of Scientific American, where they encourage you to to do different experiments. I loved chemistry at the time, but of course that meant I, I was introverted, and I wasn't a social animal. And it was a boys' school, which made it a little tougher to socialize, and had to take public transportation in most cases. But there was occasion I didn't have the money to even come back from the high school to where we lived, and it was a long walk at the end of the day. I'd always take public transportation in the morning to get there on time, but coming home, if I didn't have the funds, I walked home.
What part of Brooklyn was it in?
It was in the Fort Greene area. There's a park there, Fort Greene Park, on Myrtle Avenue and DeKalb, in that area there. And so we lived in South Brooklyn, so sometimes it was a good mile or more walk to get back home.
What were there any teachers that you remember fondly, either there or from under?
Oh.
What do you
Well,
remember
I
about your
think
teachers?
most of my teachers in grammar school liked me. I think I can't remember many of the names, although my brother, sister were close to one of them because they remembered me in one of the schools. The teachers, as I remember them, particularly toward the end, they were quite old, gray-haired school moms, primarily Irish teachers. I don't remember too many Jewish teachers, although there must have been some at the elementary school level, but of course there were quite a few at Brooklyn Tech, because that was a highly desirable school to be a teacher in, because I think the pay scale had to be higher than your average high school. It was a specialty school, so I remember many of the instructors there were frustrated college teachers that just couldn't, they were lucky to get that position. I enjoyed virtually all my teachers at high school. I think it was in the early 40s, so they were lucky to have come out of the Depression and have a position with that kind of a school. Now that I think back about it, then, because when I graduated high school, that was in 1944, we were already into the middle of World War II. And in fact, some of my classmates didn't graduate. They enlisted as soon as they reached 17. You were eligible to enlist. And some of them went into service without having received
Was that
degree.
encouraged to enlist as soon as you?
No, I don't think there was anybody there encouraging you. Although, when there were special programs, I would have not known of them if the teachers hadn't disseminated that information. I'm sure there were enlistment posters all over the high school, so everybody knew about that. And I remember at one point in my senior year, a program was announced called the Army Specialized Training Program, and you were encouraged to take an examination. And and the incentive was they guaranteed you a college education if you passed the test and enlisted. You had to enlist at 17 you could only enlist in the reserve. You could not enlist in active duty. So I took that examination. I didn't have any other options that I was aware of. I couldn't afford to go to college. It would have meant finding a job somewhere. Since I graduated as a top chemistry student, one of the big drug companies at the time was Pfizer, and they had a big operation in Brooklyn. And they were always looking for technicians, starting chemists. I mean, no one was qualified to be a graduate chemist, out of the high school level. But since Brooklyn Tech was unique and offering specialty chemistry courses, any graduate from there was quite welcomed, and so I was invited to apply for a position with Pfizer, and they would have hired me on the spot. And but the fact that I had enlisted and was eligible for draft, I just turned them down in that regard. But the day I was discharged, where most GIs on a discharge date after World War II were all eligible for what they call the 5220 Club. As a veteran, you were entitled $20 a week for 52 weeks until you found employment or entered college, since most of the veterans were eligible for the GI Bill of education, which meant free education plus a little, they paid all the tuition, and plus a little bit of extra money per month, which was about maybe $90 a month. And so I never took advantage of that 5220 veterans bonus thing. I just went back to Pfizer, and they hired me that same day, and I started working the very next day. So
Now let's talk about
okay.
your brother.
My brother.
How much younger is he? What was he like as a kid? How did that change the dynamic in the family?
And that. Well, and I think back about it. I think, he and my sister were very close to their mother, closer than I felt. I mean, I felt the motherly love, but once I realized, what my mother was like, and I could see through her. Not that I didn't love her; I did everything I could for her, but I recognized the shortcomings. I'm not sure my brother and sister ever recognized her shortcomings. Anytime I told them about different situations, they said, "Oh no, you're wrong. But anyway, of course, unfortunately,
when are you talking about?
Oh, I don't know. I think back now how close my sister was to my mother. I think my mother was too influential in her life, and really, to this day, I think my sister's not a full person because of the influence of my mother. And I don't know, possibly with the younger children, my siblings, my mother tried to maintain a tighter control, since I had already left the house at 17 and gone off to service and was away at college, or was into my studies, and then I had married by that time. But so it's possible, well, particularly with my sister, the influence never let up, and it was such that I feel my sister's life was ruined by the control my mother had over her.
Let's talk about when you were younger.
When I was young.
Before you went away to
Well, let's see.
college or high school,
My
what were they like as
my younger brother would tag along. I didn't have that many friends there, but if I had to watch over him. And I remember one incident where he was in a baby carriage in a home on the curb or in front of the house. He had to be maybe 1 or 2 years old. And we were living next to a garage. I think it was Bear Brothers, which was a chain of brake service people and lubrications garage. And a car backing up wasn't paying attention and backed over his baby carriage and ran him over while he was in the baby carriage. I don't think he was seriously injured, but it was a crisis situation, actually. My mother was frantic. My mother could get so hysterical about almost anything, as I remember, and would throw these suicide-threatening. If we didn't behave, she threatened to throw herself out of the 3rd and 4th story building. She'd go to the window, and we'd have to run after her and plead, "No, we'll be good, Mom," that kind of thing. Let's see, my brother, he was a cute little boy, chubby, and I guess when I went into the service at 17, he was 13 or 14. So all those years I didn't have much contact with him. He grew up to be a more outgoing teenager than I was. He was the handsome one and tall and thin, and I dare say I probably envied him for his, his good looks and his personality. He had great personality. He was the artist in the family, although he claims he copied everything, all the sketches I used to make. I taught him how to draw the different images and so on. He may have just copied my scratchings at the time. And I was surprised when he entered, in high school, he entered a vocational high school, aviation trades, which was a high school that taught you plane assemblies and engines and what have you. I think he only stayed in that in 1 year and then was able to get into the High School of Music and Art because of his art drawing skills that he had developed by then. And so he was fortunate enough to move into a different kind of a school, which was, I think, more interesting and more in a way more educational, more with the real art world and music world than he would have experienced, and certainly in an aviation vocational school. So that led him into his career at an early age, looking more mature than his age. He was able to take jobs that I remember he got a job as a publicity agent for a nightclub in Albany. He lived away from home, maybe at the age of 15 or 16, and someone had opened up I don't know how the contact came, it may have gotten through an agent. Back in those days, you got a position through employment agencies. I'm sure there were ads in the paper, but no one ever recognized that any jobs were that easy to follow up and read. So you usually went to an employment agency, and if they had certain skills, certain openings, and based on your experience or what they were looking to fill, and then you ended up having to pay a week's salary back to them, or a month's salary, I don't recall. It had to be a week's salary, I would guess. And that was their charge for making an appointment for you with a prospective employer. And so he ended up living away from home for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months, living in Albany. Found a Greek home where he was a tenant, and he had a lot of mature experiences, even though he was quite underage for that kind of a position. But of course, my sister was still close to my mother all the time. She went to the local high school, and I think she was bright, but she, I think, crippled emotionally, or by her ties to her mother. I mean, to the day my mother died, it was just, she actually left her husband to be with her mother the last few years of her life. I think my mother also poisoned my sister's mind against her husband. She was just, didn't want to lose control of her daughter. And I passed the qualifying examination for the ASTP, which we refer to as All Safe Till Peace, because it was a program essentially initially designed to keep the colleges from closing totally. I mean, the draft just cleaned out all of the eligible college students. They were immediately eligible for draft. Some students were allowed to get a deferment either through the year they were in class, or till they graduated, if they were close to graduation, particularly for certain skills like medicine, engineering, and maybe some language skills. But in an effort to keep the colleges open, they came up with this concept that we will start a training program for officers. But it wasn't the officer training thing. It was an effort to get qualified people, and the incentive was enlist when you're 17 if you pass this exam, and we will guarantee you a college education. And they kept many of the colleges open that way. But soon after, when I reached my 18th birthday, I was taken out of the program. A decision had been made by then to terminate that program. There was a little flack for those few years when parents, I guess, would write their congressmen. My son is in Italy, my son is in France, and my neighbor's son is still in college. And it didn't seem fair that some people would be totally exempted. And so they terminated that program. So when I reached my 18th birthday, I was initially sent to Cornell University for this training. There were many colleges that had the Army specialized training programs. They were equivalent Navy programs. The Army program was called an A-12 program. The Navy program was called a V-12. And I think there was a V-5 for midshipman school candidates. And now Cornell University is a tremendous university, so there were Marines being trained, there were Navy officers being trained. There were actually what they called U.S. MAPs, which were West Point Military Academy, U.S. Military Academy candidates that were not waiting for the next class that they could enter, and they were called preparatories. And so there were clusters of the various military on campus. We, being in the reserves, weren't issued the Army uniforms. We were issued the blue ROTC uniforms that was a program many years before the war even started. So there was always this ROTC that I guess it was the officers training program or military encouragement. And so we stood out as the lowest group on that campus. I mean, there were girls going to school at that time, and the girls were more attracted to the military older kids, and we were the 17-year-old blue boys, they called us. But, so when I reached my 18th birthday, I was taken and sent to Fort Dix to enter basic training. They had terminated the program by then, and they pulled out all the students that were in those colleges, many of them with very few exceptions, and they formed a whole division and went for training in Louisiana, and they ended up in the first waves of the Normandy invasions, and most of them were wiped out. I mean, you don't really understand the total devastation of those landing forces. Everybody sees, well, we broke through and went on with Patton's army, but the first and second waves, they just went into a slaughter. I mean, the Germans were so entrenched in Barra, they couldn't access that. By the time they overran the German defenses, the waters really were red. It was, most of the stories, never really released because of propaganda reason and morale, and the thing goes with it. But anyway, in that first invasion, the core of our brightest students at that, our brightest young men were wiped out in that. So when the need came to work on the atom bomb, which came later, they had no skilled, intelligent people that they needed to follow orders or do the kind of specialty jobs. Most of the older people were already in the service. The younger people had been wiped out, and they had no pool to draw from. So they went back to the early ASTP programs and searched through to see who was still in the service, and we were pulled out. And I happened to be one of them, and we were pulled out in the middle of the night. And actually what happened was they decided to restore that program, and they developed new programs. They only wanted engineering There were some language students that, were studying Japanese or Russian, but most of them went into either electrical, civil engineering, or maybe some chemical if they, different schools had different programs. And I was pulled out of my basic training in virtually the last week of the training, and mysteriously pulled out and sent to Virginia Polytechnic at the time in Blacksburg, Virginia, where I entered a year's accelerated program, which represented 3 years of electrical engineering. We had a choice of electrical or civil at that school, and I chose electrical. I always wonder what my career would have been like if I'd taken civil. At the time, civil meant road building and sewage treatment plants, and I'm sure there was more than that, but civil engineers, they do go into design of buildings, but that, there's an architectural concept, and the civil engineers begin some other functions. But I had taken 3 years of electrical engineering, and we had no idea about the atom bomb up until the day it was dropped, as far as we were concerned. But we did know that graduating classes would graduate every 3 months, and they would disappear. We'd never hear from them, even though we'd run into them in New York City occasionally, because that cluster was out of the New York City school system, or that area. And we knew that they were on somewhere out in Tennessee. That's all we knew. And so when the atom bomb was dropped, they were able to do it without my help. So I was able, it was just a question of demobilization. When that ended the war, the Army demobilized the 15 or 20 million people that were in service, and they did it on a point basis. You got a point for every month you were in the service, and you had maybe a double point for every month you spent overseas. And so that meant those who had been overseas the longest had the highest priorities, the most points. Immediately their units were shipped back to the United States by troop ship generally, and demobilized. And the demobilization involved an orientation, checking them and advising them of their future benefits, encouraging them to re-enlist, those who had been drafted, and allowing them to keep certain possessions. They were supposed to turn in their weapons. Some of them managed to keep their souvenirs and what have you. And then they were shipped back home, their way paid to their home. And I received an assignment to join a headquarters company, and that was an administrative unit that would demobilize units coming in. So an entire battalion would come in, an entire company would come in. And I had the function called the morning clerk, which means you add to the roster. It's a paper procedure where you enter all new personnel that join the unit, and then when they're processed 1 or 2 days later, you discharge them. And also my function was to totally demobilize on paper the unit, so it goes into the archives kind of thing. So the units would come into Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I was stationed, and they'd be totally demobilized and sent on their way. And I eventually demobilized myself when my tour of duty ended. So I put in about 30 months in the military from the day I enlisted, I guess, thereabouts. And here I am. I was one of the fortunate ones.
Did you enjoy it?
Well, every experience was new to me. I was very naive about everything, uneducated about it, virtually everything. And you got to meet people from other parts of life. You got to see. Up until that time, my exposure to people from other lands was limited. Until I went into the service at the age of 17, I had never left the state of New York. I guess we went into New Jersey because there was the Greek picnics there,
And
at the ball game.
There were minerals in New Jersey too.
Well, yeah, that's true. You're right about that.
Let's
We
not
didn't
forget
talk
the
about
minerals.
that. So the high school I went to had a mineralogy club, and it's ironic that we ended up living over the quarry virtually that we would visit on a Sunday, Monday, as part of the mineralogy group. There's no need to go into that. I think you've heard the story too many
So tell me
times.
about the army. What did you like? What
Well,
did you hate about
well,
it?
my army. Well, I saw that it was, strictly regimented life. I, I did reenlist only because by the time I was discharged, I had received quite a few grades upward. I was a private for the first 21 months of my service, and then on the 22nd became a PFC, which is the next grade, and then on the 23rd month, the following month became a T5, which was a corporal, and the following month I became a T4, and became a T3. I got one promotion after another because I was in this headquarters company, and my commanding officer would, put me in for promotion each month based on the skills that I was working with at levels that, even though I'd started at a lower rate. Anyway, in the service, of course, I met some close friends. I had a close buddy for a couple of years till he decided to give up the program, go into the military. And I've been intending to try to locate him. He's in Rochester, and I saw a number, and I thought I'd give him a call. That's just one of the things I haven't done. I had a couple of roommates. I got quite friendly with one from Brooklyn, and he taught me all about jazz. He exposed me to jazz. He was a jazz aficionado. He would bring a phonograph back with him in our room and records, and we listened to that music. And after the war, we'd get together for the Stuyvesant Casino concerts. Every Friday, it was open to anybody who wanted to come in. I think you paid for some drinks, and all the great living jazz stars of that period would come and perform. People like Jack Teagarden and Joe Bushkin, I remember, Willie the Lion Smith, a raft of the jazz greats at
Where
the
was
time.
this?
Where the
Physical place.
physical place, I'm just trying, Fillmore East.
Oh
Yeah, if it wasn't in that building, it was in one of the storefronts, if you will. There was some kind of a hall next to it, or right in that area. It was Second Avenue, and can't quite remember. It was 5th Street, 6th Street, 7th Street, and so I look forward to that. I'd meet him, or even take my friends. So living, one of my close buddies was Eddie Calisi, and I would drag him to it. He was even more naive and asocial than I was, and so we made a team. He had never gone to service. He had some kind of a deferment. So when I came out of the service, I immediately wanted to get my degree, because I never received a degree out of that, and I was able to use most of the 3 years of electrical engineering that I had toward the chemical engineering degree that I wanted. So I was able to put in a year and a half or so, and that got my degree. In the meantime, that was started at Brooklyn Polytech in the evenings, and then was able to get in full time for that year or so, and then went back to working for Cargill in the evenings. And then when I finally got my degree, I applied for a full-time job and went to work at American Seal Cap, where I was a chemist in a paper converting company that made milk bottle caps and wax
Let me
cups.
change tape now.